What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back with yet another video, and, well, yeah, this is the first of a couple of responses I'm doing to, Thralls of Metal, because over the weekend they did some really cool topical videos, so I figured, why not throw my 2 cents into these? So, here I am talking about a particular subject that they actually did not too long ago, before I recorded this, and that is bands who changed their sound for the better, for the worse, or undecided. Basically, that whole thing, because, of course, as all of us metalheads know, that there have been so many bands that have changed their sound over the years, and some of them benefited pretty damn well, others perhaps not so much, and then there are others who it's just like a steady evolution or a steady change that, well, I'd say neutral in that regard. So here I am talking about 10 other bands because, well, the Thralls guys talked about 10 pretty big ones. Even Metallica, even though I don't 100% agree with, like Load and Reload being completely bad, I would say, yeah, they got worse compared to the first 5 albums, but that's neither here nor there, and I'm not including them in this list, so because I actually have 10 different bands that I think would warrant this discussion. And I'm going to kick things off with a pretty big one near and dear to my heart, Avenge Sevenfold. Of course, Avenge Sevenfold, one of the biggest bands in the world, really ever since like maybe 2006, 2007, somewhere in that time frame. Yeah, they've become one of the biggest bands in the world, and I've been along for their ride almost their entire career, minus the debut, which, they started out more of like a metalcore band, kind of, I would say, more on the punk side of metalcore, considering like all the original members of Avenged Sevenfold kind of came from more of a punk rock and heavy metal background. The debut album, Sounding the Seventh Trumpet, was definitely metalcore, and it was plenty heavy, but with the songwriting and like some of the drum beats on there from the late great Rev, and even some of like the vocals, definitely kind of harken to more of like a punk rock vibe to their metalcore sound. It was almost like as if you took bands like Bad Religion and the Misfits and mixed them with like Bleeding Through or Earth Crisis to some degree, kind of like a hybrid of all that on the first album at least. And while it was a decent foundation for the band, once Waking the Fallen came out 2 years later in 2003, they were still metalcore, but it was way more on the metal end of the scale. In fact, I would still say it's their heaviest album to this day. Like, the guitar tone is big and massive, the songs are phenomenal, and like, I would say, I don't know if I could necessarily call it 100% metalcore, because more than 80% of the album has guitar solos, and that was mostly down to Sinister Gates coming in full time as the lead player and delivering some of the shreddiest leads of that time frame for that late end of nu metal, beginning of like the melodic metalcore explosion that would happen throughout the 2000s. And like, you hear that album and you hear elements of like melodic death metal, power metal, thrash metal, kind of across the board on that album. And then after that, you get to an album like City of Evil, where the screaming, growled vocals pretty much more or less were gone by the time we get 2 years later into City of Evil, because Matt Shadows, or M. Shadows, made that conscious decision that he didn't want to do screaming vocals anymore, and that he just wanted to do full-on melodic singing. So they basically abandoned metalcore and fully embraced just being a metal band. Like, combining, classic heavy metal, thrash metal, little hints of power metal, and even a dash of prog kind of sprinkled in on City of Evil, on especially the longer tracks. But then you get to, like, the White Album, where it was definitely more of an experimental album, and they took a gamble by trying to do many different things. Like, some songs kind of had a little bit of that old metalcore vibe, even though they weren't metalcore tracks. Even some, like, avant-garde stuff, with the case of, like, A Little Piece of Heaven or Dear God, where they went full-on country, which I'd argue Avenge Sevenfold does a country song better than like 95% of modern country artists today, which is saying how terrible country music is nowadays. And then you fast forward to Nightmare, where it's like City of Evil Part 2, and it was a great kind of return to form a little bit for the City of Evil fans, and also Mike Portnoy helping out on drums after we lost to Rev. And then Hail to the King was kind of more like early 90s metal worship, like Megadeth, Metallica in particular, but they took a gamble, and I think it paid off. I thought it was still a good album. And now we're into the current era, where they're basically a progressive metal band. Like, The Stage, I still think is a fantastic album, especially that closing track, Exist. Like, there's almost everything on that song. Thrash metal, death metal chugs and breakdowns, great, like, power metal-esque soloing, and awesome blast beats, and so on and so forth. And then Life is But a Dream, which is still a rather batshit insane album in terms of songwriting, but I still think it has its moments. I don't think it's as bad as some people made it out to be. I definitely prefer it over Sounding the Seventh Trumpet, that's for damn sure, but it wouldn't rank pretty high. But it's still got its moments here and there. I still will go back to a song or two, but as far as the answer to the question, did they get better or worse? Just based off of songwriting improvement and like musicianship improvement, I will say they got better. Regardless of how you feel about Avenged Sevenfold, I'd say compared to the first album, they've gotten better over time. Just in like a few different increments over time in their careers. So I would say Avenged Sevenfold got better. Now, the next band, and this one's going to be very difficult to talk about considering there's like 4 or 5 eras almost for this band. Darkthrone. Of course, probably my favorite Norwegian metal band of all time is Darkthrone because, you know, like I said, they went through so many different changes in their sound. You know, they started out as a death metal band. You know, Soulside Journey, I think, is a very underrated debut, and I'm not the only one that says that. That album is legit fantastic death metal that even borders on technical death metal a little bit. And then big 180 after that, and they go straight into the black metal revolution happening in Norway in the early 90s with the unholy trinity of A Blaze in the Northern Sky, which is still my favorite Darkthrone album of all time. Under a Funeral Moon is pretty good. Not the world's biggest fan of Transylvanian Hunger. It was just kind of like a one-trick pony album for me. But then you get into Panzerfaust, which is fucking fantastic as well. Yeah, Total Death, still good, but it does feel like a bit of a drop-off. And then Goat Lord, not the best. And then, you know, over time, they began morphing into so many other facets, like Ravishing Grimness, which is an amazing album where they started to incorporate a little bit of punk and classic heavy metal, just a little bit into their sound. And then, yeah, Plague Wielder, not the best, but then you get to, you know, Hate Them and Sardonic Wrath, where they just got the heft back and it was much heavier. And then you entered the punk era of the band, you know, with Cult is Alive and FOAD. Didn't rank really high on my list, but I don't think they're bad albums. I just think it's just kind of like another big 180 from where they were in the past decade and a half, actually. But then you get to an album like Dark Thrones and Black Flags, where they started to tease where they were going to go next, and then kind of fully embraced it on Circle to Wagons, where it was no more really of the punk or crust punk elements and more towards classic heavy metal and speed metal. And then that fully came together on the Underground Resistance, which I'd say started where we are now with Darkthrone, and that's classic heavy metal Darkthrone. Underground Resistance was fantastic. Arctic Thunder, while still good, it felt like they tried too hard to kind of appease the black metal fans by bringing back the gruffer vocals. But then from, I would say, Old Star to right now, they have been firing on all cylinders. Like, every album since Old Star has been amazing. Like, It Beckons Us All, that came out earlier this year, might still be in my top 5 on the year-end list when we get to that video in December. So yeah, this one's the difficult one because, you know, they've changed around so much over time, and there are fans who only like the death metal era, the early stuff, which I know somebody who only will listen to that. Then, of course, you have the black metal purists that love the black metal period. You might have some fans of the more crust punk elements into their sound. And then you got fans like me who really loves the classic heavy metal era that we're in with Dark Throne, while still having some black metal elements, whether it be in the tremolo riffs or the vocals. So, honestly, when it comes down to Dark Throne, you know, I'm going to say neutral on this one, because there are definitely moments of shine in every era. Like, even in the crust punk era, like Dark Thrones and Black Flags, I think is actually a really solid album for that style. And then, of course, like almost everything of this classic metal period, for the most part, has been incredible. And then, of course, you know, Soulside Journey was amazing. And then some of the black metal stuff, like particularly A Blaze in the Northern Sky, Panzerfaust, Ravishing Grimness, and Sardonic Wrath in particular, I think are amazing. So I'm going to say neutral. Like, I don't think they changed for the better or for the worse. It's just Dark Throne doing what Dark Throne does. Alright, and then kind of in a similar vein to Dark Throne, in terms of like changing up every so often, the next band I'm going to be talking about, Intuned. So, yes, Intuned, one of the godfathers, arguably even back when they were Nihilist, the godfathers of Swedish death metal, and the godfathers of that buzzsaw, a Boss HM2 guitar tone that still felt in today's metal as a whole. You know, the first two albums, Left Hand Path and Clandestine, are fantastic, even though Left Hand Path is like god tier death metal albums, period. And then they shifted, you know, on Wolverine Blues when they began to go more into creating a style of their own called Death and Roll. And for that style, Wolverine Blues was fantastic, but then they began to drop off, you know, with the next couple albums. You know, DCLXVI, I was not the biggest fan of, particularly because of that production. And then Same Difference is one big giant pile of boom boom poo poo. And yeah, even the band didn't like that album. So then you get into kind of a resurgence period with Uprising and Morningstar, which, you know, Uprising kind of back to that death and roll style, but kind of like a sludgier style of death and roll, like evolving from where they were on Wolverine Blues, and gritty sounding. And then you get into Morningstar, which I would say kind of returned a little bit to their death metal sound, but also a lot of thrash on there. Little hints of death and roll in there, but it was more like death and thrash kind of all over the place on that album, and I think that's still one of their best. And then they began to drop off with, you know, Inferno and Serpent Saints, which I was not a big fan of either of those albums either. And if you want to include Entombed AD, they progressively got better with the three albums that Entombed AD did. Particularly Bowels of Earth, I think, was fantastic. But I'll just go ahead and say it personally. While it's not like horrible or anything, I will probably say that Entombed changed for the worse, because compared to the first two albums, it just didn't hit me as hard. Even though Wolverine Blues was pretty high up on my rankings, same with Morningstar and Uprising, in comparison to the first two albums from Entombed, just doesn't hit you right in the feels as much as those albums do. Alright, and then back to Sweden we go. The next band I'm going to be talking about is Bathory. Now, this one's really difficult because I'm a big fan of Bathory, you know, arguably the true pioneers of black metal. It's like, yeah, you had Venom, but compared to Bathory, who evolved that into proper black metal, what black metal became after that with the Norwegian scene, Bathory are the godfathers. You know, the first self-titled album, definitely more like that Venom worship, but also a lot of like thrash on there, and it's a killer debut. And then you get to the Return, where they began to properly solidify. Like, Horthon finally was starting to hone in on what black metal really should and could be. You know, with like faster drums, but still retaining a little bit of what you heard on the first album. And then, Under the Sign of the Black Mark is objectively still the greatest black metal album of all time and basically set the tone for black metal to come across the board around the world. And then, slight shift with Blood, Fire, Death. It's still black metal, but it got more thrashy again. But you also started to get a little bit of where Bathory was going to go on the next album, which was more classic heavy metal, doom metal, and folk metal with like the Nordic Viking folk instrumentation with the acoustic guitars and some of the rhythms that are marching on. But that album's still fantastic. And even a couple songs featuring little clean vocals. But then you get to Hammerheart, where they pretty much, Quorthon solidified what he wanted Bathory to become, and that was classic heavy metal, doom metal, and folk metal kind of mashed together. And I still say Hammerheart's a brilliant album. Same with the follow-up, Twilight of the Gods. Then you had the lesser period in the mid-90s when they did Requiem and Octagon, when they went more thrash and borderline groove metal, but I don't think those albums are as bad as a lot of people have made them out to be over the years. But then they kind of get back on track with Blood on Ice, and then Destroyer of Worlds kind of felt like Quorthon was trying to combine what he was doing in the early 90s and the mid 90s, and it was still okay, but not quite there. But then, thankfully, despite, Quorthon sadly no longer with us, but the final two albums, the Nordland 1 and 2, phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal albums right there. So, this is kind of a similar vein to Darkthrone, where it's like, Bathory changed up quite a bit over time. There was only one era that doesn't get a lot of love, and that was that mid-90s thrashy, groovy period. But almost any other era of Bathory is universally well-loved by metalheads, depending on who they are. So I would make the argument that perhaps... you could go either way. You could argue they got better because Quorthon got better as a songwriter and vocalist, but then there will be some people who said that they might have gotten worse because it's not like the black metal period. I'm going to go ahead and say I'm neutral when it comes to Bathory because, I love the black metal period, but I also love the classic doom folk period. Hammerheart, Twilight of the Gods, Blood on Ice, and the Nordland albums, I think are legit brilliant. Then the black metal period from the debut through Blood, Fire, Death, absolutely brilliant. So, yeah, I'm going to say neutral. It was just Bathory being Bathory, Quorthon doing what Quorthon liked to do, and that was experiment. But now moving into a band that's, I can imagine seeing comments about this one, Decapitated. So, of course, Decapitated, the amazing, well, at least, amazing technical death metal band from Poland back in the 90s when they were all just kids, teenagers, like just playing death metal arguably better than most during the mid to late 90s when people thought death metal was on its way out. Then you get a band like Decapitated that kind of gave death metal a big shot in the arm with some crazy technicality, but with catchy hooks and grooves going on. Like, Winds of Creation, I will say, is arguably one of the top 10 greatest death metal debuts of all time. That album is insanely just visceral. Like, it's everything I love about what tech death really should and could be. Not so much about the wankery, but more into complexity and at times catchy hooks. And then you get to an album like Nility, which pretty much continues on where Winds of Creation left off. Granted, maybe a little compressed production a little bit. And then you get to albums like The Negation and Organic Hallucinosis. Pretty much Decapitated being Decapitated. Then, sadly, Vitek, their original drummer, was sadly killed in a bus accident, and that really affected the band to the point where they took basically a 2-year hiatus, came back in 2009 with a completely different lineup, only, I'm not even going to try to pronounce the guitarist's name, but Vitek's brother, the only original member, still in the band. And over time, with the new vocalist, Rasta, I forget his name, but he's not my favorite vocalist in death metal. In fact, he kind of fits more in tune with like groove metal vocalists, and that's kind of where Decapitated ended up throughout the 2010s decade, and that was being more of a groove metal band with moments of who they were back in the 2000s, and it just, like Carnival's Forever, Blood Mantra, and Anti-Cult, not really my bag. But then you get to a couple years ago when they released Cancer Culture, and I actually thought that album was great. Like, honestly, it sounded like a bit of a return to form for Decapitated, kind of going back a little bit to where they were in the 2000s. Still had some of that 2010s groove metal, but it was used more effectively. And Cancer Culture made my year-end list in 2022. I legit thought it was great. The title track, Last Supper was a brutal closer. Like, there was some killer songs on that album. So, yeah, they're maybe making a return to their old school sound. Maybe the next album will be even more of that. But I will go ahead and say I think Decapitated changed for the worse. Not that it was, like, horrible or anything. It's just, in comparison to their 2000s stuff, just does not hold a candle, especially to the first two albums, Winds of Creation and Nility. Just nowhere close. And I'm sticking with that. Alright, so we're halfway through, so we got 5 more bands to go. Next up, we're going to talk about a big one. A band I recently did a discography ranking for back a few months ago, Pantera. So yeah, Pantera, the mighty Texans with those swinging riffs that everybody, well, most people love. Started out more on the glam metal thing, back in the 80s when they were the glam boys from Texas. And yeah, the first album, yeah, Metal Magic, no. And then Projects in the Jungle got better. I Am the Night got better. And then Power Metal, I think, is one of the most underrated metal albums of all time. And then you get to Cowboys from Hell onward, where Pantera became groove metal and became one of the big leaders for heavy metal as a whole during a period where most people thought metal was on its way out in the 90s, when, again, I'm going to say it, that is the biggest hyperbole in the history of music. Metal wasn't dying, it was growing in the underground. So, Pantera, just total shift, from the 80s and then into the 90s, all the way up to reinventing the steel in 2000. So, not much else to say about this that I haven't said already during the ranking video, so I will just go ahead and say Pantera changed for the better. That's not even a contest, because, again, power metal is amazing, very underrated, but then you get into the era from Cowboys on, maybe not reinventing the steel, even though that's still a good album. I don't like it as much as I like power metal, but the 4 albums in the 90s, mwah, phenomenal stuff. So yeah, Pantera changed for the better. Excuse me. Alright, next up, I'm going to be talking about another band from the big 4 of thrash that Thralls didn't talk about, and that is Anthrax. So yeah, Anthrax, kind of an odd history I have with this band. Like, at one point I was all about them. Then I kind of fell out once I was listening to other bands. And then I did the ranking last year, and it did make me appreciate some more of their stuff a little bit more. Fistful of Metal, pretty cool debut. Not the biggest fan of Neil Turbin's vocals, but then you get to, the Joey Belladonna era, the first Joey Belladonna era with Spreading the Disease, and Among the Living especially being classic thrash albums. State of Euphoria, solid, but you could definitely tell was rushed, but then Persistence of Time is phenomenal. Then Joey left, and then you get John Bush from Armored Saint coming in, and you'd think he was going to keep his higher register that he did in Armored Saint, but no, he kind of goes into more of like the alternative metal, groove metal approach, and the band as a whole kind of went down that route, basically from Sound of White Noise all the way through to We've Come For You All, and I said it during that ranking, not a great era for Anthrax. I mean, Sound of White Noise was pretty damn good, but that was pretty much it, because Stomp 442 wasn't that good, Volume 8's pretty terrible, and We've Come For You All has moments, but still not enough to win me over. Then the last 2 albums we've gotten with Joey Belladonna back into the band, Worship Music and For All Kings, have been great albums. it sucks that it's been over 8 years since we've had an Anthrax album, and we keep hearing rumblings of a new album, but it doesn't sound like it's going to end up happening because, you know, with Frankie now playing live for Satyricon, and Scotty and been doing his thing with Mr. Bungle, Charlie Benante doing the Pantera tribute tour, and who the hell knows what Joey and John Dene have been doing in this meantime, probably wondering, are we going to get to work on this at any time, guys? Like, we need to get this out. But I'll just go ahead and say I think Anthrax changed for the worse. Even though, like, the last two albums, they've been steadily coming back to where they were back in the 80s and early 90s, but in comparison to, you know, Spreading, Among, Persistence, just isn't quite there yet. So, yeah, I think they changed for the worse. Alright, next up we get to another band that's kind of near and dear to my heart, considering they were a pretty big band for me in high school. Trivium. Of course, Trivium, these Florida-based metalers, Matt Heafy is a musical mastermind. Like, he can play any style and do it very well, as proven in that Roadrunner United All-Star Session CD where he played like any kind of metal style you wanted. Whether it would be thrash, whether it be stoner, or even black metal and death metal. He can play it all. He's got a really good voice, amazing guitarist. So with Trivium, you know, they often get lumped into the metalcore thing. I don't think that's 100% accurate because, yes, Trivium had the breakdowns. Yeah, Trivium had the sing-scream vocals. But I will say it again, the one characteristic that disqualifies Trivium from being a metalcore band, guitar solos. There are always guitar solos on Trivium albums. Excuse me. And if your album has more than 75-80% guitar solos, then you're not a metalcore band. So I would just say Trivium were just a metal band. You know, the first album, Ember to Inferno, kind of like a nice hybrid of thrash metal and melodic death metal, and I think it's a pretty underrated debut. And then you get to Ascendancy, which is still one of the best albums of the 2000s. Like, that album is fucking brilliant. Then you get to The Crusade, which I know is very divisive among fans because people said that that's basically a Metallica worship album. Even if it wasn't, it's still a great album where they pretty much abandoned the metalcore tropes and embraced thrash metal and put out a damn good thrash album. Shogun, excuse me, Shogun kind of embracing where they are currently, and that's more prog elements into their songwriting. Still very thrashy and kind of a return to some of the metalcore tropes, particularly the sing scream. But musically, it's not metalcore. I would say it's like prog and thrash and groove metal kind of mashed together. But then you enter the lesser period in the middle, you know, with In Waves. I was pumped to hear that album when it came out in 2011, and then I heard it, and apart from Caustic Are the Ties That Bind, not really much memory of that album. And then Vengeance Falls, I would still say is probably their worst album. It's not that good. Silence in the Snow, I thought was actually pretty solid, pretty okay. Like, there were some songs I liked on it. But then you get to the current run that started with The Sin, The Sentenced, and then What the Dead Men Say, and In the Core of the Dragon, kind of a return to where they were on albums like Shogun and Ascendancy, but done with a more modern touch. But while those last three albums have been pretty damn good, doesn't hold a candle to the first four albums. Excuse me. In my personal opinion. So I'm going to have to say I think Trivium changed for the worse in that regard. Alright, so now we get into one that I think is going to be very interesting to hear people's opinions about, Gorguts. So yeah, Gorguts, the Quebec death metal legends, one of the best out of Canada as a whole. You know, Luc Lemay, a legitimate composer of metal. Like, the way he approaches songwriting feels more like classical composition than most. But yeah, you get to like their first two albums, you know, Considered Dead and Erosion of Sanity. Like those are phenomenal classic death metal albums. You know, Considered Dead being more of that like old school death metal sound, whereas Erosion of Sanity still has that, but it's also pushing towards technical death metal. Like the songwriting got more technical and a little more cerebral. As I had a hiccup, as I was saying cerebral. But then you enter into the bizarre era, perhaps, of Gorguts that started with Obscura, where it's still tech death, but there's so much insane shit going on, you know, with like these weird rhythms and odd riff arrangements, you know, and that album is definitely an acquired taste. Like, I know there are some people that don't like that album, but there are others that absolutely love that album. And I think it's a legit great album, Obscura. It's just, yeah, it might suffer for being a little bit too long and a little too kind of out of left field for a lot of death metal fans, but I still think it's a legit phenomenal for what it was. Then you get into an album from Wisdom to Hate where it's almost like they kind of crystallized the sound of what they were doing on Obscura, but make it a little more palatable. And it was probably one of the most underrated albums of the 2000s. Then broke up, came back with Colored Sands 11 years ago, which was an awesome comeback album for Gorguts. And then 3 years later, we got the Pallades Dust EP, which I thought was phenomenal in its own right, kind of like a nice hybrid of Obscura and Colored Sands. And you can definitely tell that, you know, from Obscura on, that was kind of a big influence on bands like Ulcerate and Deathspell Omega, or any other band that incorporates like bizarre dissonance and technicality into extreme metal. So, I mean, I don't know, this is another one kind of in a similar vein with, you know, I kind of like Bathory, where you could make arguments for either or, where you could argue they got better, or you could argue they got worse, depending on your taste, like whether you're a bigger fan of the more old school death metal, technical death metal stylings of the first two albums, or you like the more technical and bizarre dissonance from Obscura onward. So in this case, by default, I would say neutral, because I love stuff from both eras of Gorguts. Like, I love the old school death metal stuff. Also, the tech death that was on Erosion of Sanity. And then, of course, I do like the bizarre, chaotic dissonance and technicality of everything they've done from Obscura to where they are now. And hopefully we'll be getting a new album by next year. And I guess Luke's finally working on stuff, so hopefully new Gorguts pretty soon. And then the final band that I'm going to be talking about, and this one I think is going to generate some debate, and that is Amorphis. The long-standing legends from Finland, you know, they were one of the pioneers of the Finnish death metal scene back in the very end of the 80s heading into 1990. Yeah, they were one of the pioneers, along with bands like Convulse and Sentenced, Pertinence, among others from that time frame during like 89, 90, in that era. And of course, you know, the first album, the Carillion Isthmus, which is a very dark album, kind of more death doom, like a very straight down the line death doom album, but with more melodic sections at times, kind of like a precursor to melodic death metal in some regard. Then you get to Tales from the Thousand Lakes, which is still one of their best albums, arguably still is the best Amorphis album, you know, definitely less death doom and more towards melodic death metal and prog metal to some degree. Like that song Black Winter Day, still a legit fantastic song for that style. Then you get to Elegy, which is vastly different, like cleaner and slicker, but still has mellow death to it. And honestly, like, that's kind of been their boat ever since 1996 Elegy. Like, they've been like more of a straight up melodic death metal band that has some folk elements at times and some prog in there as well. And it's been a very steady evolution for them. And I actually almost have everything they've done, even though I've not listened to it all. I have listened to some Amorphis in my life. From both eras, the early Death Doom stuff and the more mellow death with like hard rock hooks and more kind of mainstream sensibility in the songwriting. And there's stuff to love from both eras for sure. Like, but if I were to make the argument of whether or not they changed for the better or for the worse, you know, while Tales from the Thousand Lakes in that early era is still a classic, I think in terms of consistency and staying the course of a certain style of metal, I will argue I think Amorphis have changed for the better because, you know, especially like the last few albums, you know, Halo, which came out a couple of years ago, I thought that was a fantastic album. That was one of my first perfect scores I've given to an album during my renaissance of doing album reviews on the channel in 2021 to where we are now. But I thought that was a brilliant album, like mellow death with some hard rock hooks. And Amorphis are just amazing songwriters and performers. Everybody in that band just knows what to do and know how to write great music. So while the early stuff has its place, Tales from the Thousand Lakes is amazing and maybe my favorite Amorphis album, but in terms of consistency, I think they changed for the better. But of course, all those are just my opinions, but I want to hear what you guys think. Let me know in the comments below if you don't make videos on YouTube, but if you are watching this and do make videos, I'd love to hear some bands that myself or Nick and John from Thralls didn't mention that you think changed their sound for the better or for the worse. That remains to be seen to hear what else we got coming up. But anyways, thank you guys for watching. Like, comment, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff. I still got a couple more videos to do, including another response to Thralls, and as well as a special announcement coming this Thursday on my birthday. Dirty 30 boy over here. But anyways, until then, keep your horns high and your dreams wet.
Thank you for your patronage.